Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is José Iván Rodríguez Sánchez, and I'm a research scholar at the Baker Institute Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University. One of the greatest challenges in Mexico today is the rule of law. The rule of law begins by an effective state capacity to implement the law. And talking about this issue takes us directly to the role that state police forces play in ensuring that a country enjoys public safety and security, so that citizens can not only exercise their rights, but also engage in activities that will help them thrive and prosper. In that sense, and given that the administration of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador disbanded the federal police and created in its stead a National Guard, all in 2019, it becomes important to understand how well it is performing in its assigned task. The idea of the National Guard was supposed to be to face and reduce organized crime, but it has not been the case. In fact, crime and violence in Mexico has only gotten worse. This issue has become more concerning since President Andrés Manuel López Obrador took office in 2018. His administration has not been able to reduce insecurity in Mexico, and many other factors have further compromised the ability of the Mexican state to deal with public safety and security, such as the poor performance of the Mexican economy and the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, the hugs, not balls, abrazos, no balazos strategy has not worked at all, and Mexico is facing the worst insecurity crisis in years. The numbers speak for themselves. As an example, Mexicans live with a high level of violence that includes an average of 36,000 homicide victims per year, or about 3,000 international homicide victims per month. The homicide rate is about 29 per 100,000 people, a figure roughly 5 times that of the United States. President López Obrador had promised to take the military out of its public safety role, but he instead has provided even more power to a rather militarized National Guard and the armed forces. The National Guard has been assigned many duties, such as stemming the flow of migrants from Central America, helping build new infrastructure, and distributing vaccines, among others. But it seems that the strategy to contain organized crime is not among its priorities. Given this brief overview, we explore today key issues around Mexico's militarized National Guard and its impact on public safety and security. Thus, it is a pleasure today to have Professor Richard Kilroy Jr. to talk about Mexico's National Guard and analyze its impact on public safety in Mexico and the US-Mexico security relationship. I will provide a brief bio of Professor Kilroy. Professor Kilroy is a non-resident scholar in the Baker Institute Center for the United States and Mexico. He's an associate professor of politics at Coastal Carolina University in South Carolina. Professor Kilroy previously taught at East Carolina University, the Virginia Military Institute, and National Defense University. He also worked as a defense contractor, teaching courses for the U.S. Air Force's Air War University and the U.S. Army's Special Warfare Center and School. Prior to entering academia, Professor Kilroy completed 23 years of active duty military service in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence and Latin American Foreign Area Officer. Professor Kilroy has also published articles on North American security, Homeland Security, Latin America defense issues, and intelligence studies in numerous academic journals. Professor Kilroy received a BS in political science from Santa Clara University and a master and PhD degree in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Thank you very much, Professor Kilroy, for being here today, and you will have around 30 minutes for your remarks on Mexico's National Guard. Then I will ask some questions from the audience to start a conversation. People who are online can use the Q&A button, and people here can raise their hand after the presentation. So, Professor Quirio, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Yvonne. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you for moderating the panel, too.
Thank
First,
you.
though, I do have to thank Tony and Lisa for allowing me to come and be part of Rice University now for this semester. I'm actually on what our university calls a scholarly reassignment. They used to call them sabbaticals, but they don't like that term anymore. So I'm on a scholarly reassignment here for Rice, and I really appreciate the opportunity to spend 6 weeks here furthering this research, but also getting to further contacts and getting to know the people here with the Baker Institute. And I've enjoyed getting to know Yvonne the last couple of days as well. Just to kind of start things off, Yvonne mentioned a little bit of my background. We went through a recent change at my university. Oh, just to back up a minute, people, what is Coastal Carolina University? The blue chicken is actually our mascot. It's called a Chanticleer. It's comes from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and we are because we're a state university in South Carolina. We couldn't be the Gamecocks because that's USC's motto. So we had to go with a different type of mascot. So that's our Chanticleer mascot. But we are a public university, a regional comprehensive university, about 10,000 students, expanding our graduate programs in particular to try to get up to about 12,000. But it is a university that basically stood up an intelligence and national security studies program about 8 years ago, and that's what brought me to teach at Coastal. So for the first 6 years, the first part of that, I taught primarily intelligence and national security studies, given my background as an intelligence officer in the military. But then I switched over in the Department of Political Science. They split off, they changed colleges. So now I get to focus on my real love, which is teaching international relations, foreign policy, and focusing on Latin America and particularly on Mexico. As Yvonne mentioned, I do have a background as a military officer, so I did serve in capacities as an intelligence officer, but also as what they call a Latin American Foreign Area Officer. For the U.S. Army, that's like an equivalent. It's a political military affairs, so it's kind of like the equivalent of a State Department Foreign Service officer. We do more of kind of the hybrid political military aspects. And so I had an opportunity to do that in Mexico. I was assigned to Defense Attaché office as an exchange officer to the Mexican military, and actually was an exchange student to what they call the ESG, or the Escuela Superior de Guerra, which is an equivalent of our Command and General Staff College. It's called the War College, but it's not the same as the Army War College in the U.S. military system. And then I went on later to become a desk officer at U.S. Southern Command and was the Mexico desk officer, working security assistance, political military affairs. Because back at that time, Mexico was considered unassigned, meaning we did not put Mexico or Canada into one of a regional combatant commander's areas of responsibility. Like you have EUCOM and CENTCOM and PACOM now, Indo-PACOM. But with the stand-up of NORTHCOM now, Mexico and Canada now come under the Northern Command's area of combatant responsibilities. But when I was working at SOUTHCOM, we had security assistance responsibilities for Mexico, and so coordinating a lot of that. And this was right after the Zapatista uprising, and it was kind of an interesting time because Mexico really didn't want to draw too close to the United States, but really wanted to take some advantage of some security assistance programs, particularly because of the Zapatista uprising in the early 90s. Also, my background was to do academic research on Mexico. I wrote my dissertation on civil-military relations in Mexico, which in the 1980s, there wasn't a whole lot written about it. It was just one of these kind of sui generis type military institutions that didn't fit Sam Huntington's model of civil-military relations in Latin America when you looked at all the other countries. And that's kind of where my thesis went, is to kind of explain that and try to expand on, you know, why Mexico developed the military the way it did. So the payback was for the military to fund me and go back to college and write my dissertation. They said, you've got to go to Mexico and be an exchange officer to the Mexican military. And so I got to do that after I did my graduate studies. In an ideal world, I would have done it before because I got all of that firsthand, you know, original source research that came out of, you know, spending a year with the Mexican military. And the funny thing was, I came out of it afterwards, and you know, they're like, they really do think that way. Actually, what I wrote about was pretty accurate. So it was kind of surprising to see that, you know, the research kind of panned out in many ways. And I have written more recently on North American security in terms of looking at U.S., Canada, and Mexico security cooperation with a colleague, Abelardo Rodriguez, who teaches at Ibero in Mexico City, and Todd Hatley, who's a Canadian academic who's also a retired RCMP. So we try to bring military, civilian, and a policing side into a lot of our research and studies. And so we've authored a couple books and articles together. Just as a little bit of a factoid before I begin, one of the few things I did get to do, which was a really neat experience, is when I was in Panama, the Mexican Navy, I was invited to actually transit the Panama Canal aboard the Mexican naval sailing ship, the Cuauhtemoc. And so my wife and my oldest daughter and I were guests of the Mexican Navy and got a chance to do that, which was fascinating to actually go through the Panama Canal on a tall-masted sailing ship. And oh, by the way, they really do stand on the lanyards like that when they pull into port. The Mexican national anthem plays and the big flag comes out, and it's quite a spectacle to see one of these sailing ships actually do that and go through the Panama Canal. So what I'd like for you to do today for this presentation is I want to give a little bit of a background, kind of a scene setter to understand the Mexican military, the concept of how the military developed in Mexico, how it is evolving as a result of some of these more recent changes and standing up organizations like a new Guardia Nacional, and also kind of understanding some of the previous attempts that were made at public safety reform in Mexico under previous administrations. So a lot of it reflects some of my previous research, which is in the paper that Lisa provided here. If you want to read more on the actual, this was the article that was published last year. And that began as research when it came here for a panel in 2019 to assess kind of the first 6 months of AMLO's tenure in office. And so I focused particularly on this issue of his national plan for peace and security and the formation of the National Guard. That turned into this paper. What I'm doing now is expanding on that because of some of the more recent changes that have taken place, some reorganization changes that have occurred. And so my next paper hopefully will be an update to that paper as well. So that's kind of the format that I'll follow for our talk. So just to give a little bit of background, again, I'm not going to get too deep into history, but just you got to think about the context of how the military is viewed in Mexico and the historical context of the Spanish colonial legacy, these key pillars or institutions of Mexican society. And of course, the military was a key component of that early on for the first couple hundred years of Mexico's history. And it would really be summed up when you saw this kind of who belongs to the oligarchy. The old saying was, if a hacendado had 3 sons, one would become a priest, one would become a government official, and the other would join the military. So it was kind of this oligarchy in terms of how Mexican society evolved around that Spanish colonial model. And I think it's very evident if you go to Mexico City and have seen any of these very elaborate retreat ceremonies they do down on the Zocalo, the main plaza. They have the huge Mexican flag, the military's out there, it's a very elaborate ceremony. But the organization of the Zocalo itself reflects that Spanish colonial heritage because you see, the Plaza Mayor, you see the Palacio Nacional, the government head, the Spanish colonial church, and then it would have been the Cuartel General, it would have been the military headquarters originally on that plaza. So those 3 main institutions were a very key part of how societies were structured in Latin America, and of course Mexico being part of that. The revolutionary leaders themselves, if you look at the military as a component of how the society evolved during its independence period, they came from Mexico, again, being a very class-oriented society. Is you had criollos and the peninsulares. The peninsulares would have been the full-blooded Spaniards who were born in Spain and ruled the society in Mexico. The criollos, Creoles would be those full-blooded Spaniards, of course, who lived in the New World, but in this case, were born in the New World and were more identified with that. So you had this, the original independence period, as I said, was a revolution, but it wasn't. It was more of a political, but not necessarily a social revolution. So within that, you had these elements of the Spanish colonial oligarchy there. For example, some of the early military leaders would be something like Agustin de Iturbide, who was Criollo, in this case, of full Spanish blood. But then you had Father Hidalgo, the picture of the Orozco, the Diego Rivera Merle, leading the revolution, but then you also see elements of Mexican society in there with the mestizo class, the Indian classes, and the other parts that were part of that revolutionary period. And you can actually see that Rivera actually included, you can see Iturbide in that mural, as well as Vicente Guerrero, some of the other earlier leaders were actually painted into that. So you had this combination of military and radical priest and Mexican society, all of that kind of combined in the Mexican Revolution, but it was still a very stratified society. So the leaders of Mexico, and Iturbide himself becomes emperor of Mexico, so the first president per se is a military leader, and that military history takes place throughout the first, of course, the first 100 years of Mexico's history. In the 1900s is when you have the revolutionary period, and this is where the military character changes a little bit in terms of the military leaders themselves. So you have regional strongmen, like, for example, Zapata would have been an example of that in looking at, in the background of where the different people came from in Morelos. Pancho Villa, of course, up in Sonora, in Chihuahua, and the areas in the north. Porfirio Diaz, the man in the middle, was in this case, the head of Mexico for over 30 years, military leader that, again, epitomized the control of the government by the military in Mexico during the Porfiriato. And he was the one who many might remember the famous saying, poor Mexico, so far from God, but so close to the United States. So the Porfiriato was the change when Mexico, the revolutionary period, when we had this change in also a social revolution as well as a political revolution. And you had new military leaders. For example, Álvaro Obregón was part of this new military cadre that took over, and basically those military leaders succeeded each other, fought with each other for control of Mexico, but still very much identified around these ideas of kind of regional caudillos, regional identification. How did you build a national identification in Mexico? And that was one of the key things that came as a result of the Mexican Revolution, was to create a national identity. And these military leaders like Calles and others, and Carranza and Obregón, were a key part of that in forming the political structure in Mexico, but also in terms of reorganizing and reforming the military culture as well. Obregón made the famous comment, he lost one of his arms in battle. He used to say that people trusted him because he only had one arm, so he could steal less than other politicians. And he also made the famous statement about he didn't know any general who could resist the blast of 50,000 pesos. So the key to actually trying to, to co-opt the military was done not by increasing their budget, but actually by cutting it, and actually by, in this case, trying to create more professionalism in the Mexican military. And people like Obregón were a key part of that early on. And another key part of it was obviously the schooling, was to create military schools that would actually contribute to creating more of a professionalized military as opposed to a praetorian military. And key founding of that, again, is that the military, like part of the oligarchy, was one of the key pillars of forming what became the PRI. It went through a couple different iterations, the PNR, PRM, but eventually the Revolutionary Party in Mexico that controlled politics for 70 years initially was led by these military leaders during the revolution that was trying to get the military out of politics. And so as a result, the PRI actually co-opted the military became a part of that. And so when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, I came up with a new model basically to challenge some of Sam Huntington's thesis. And I called it was the armed party model in Mexico, that basically the PRI itself, because the military was part of it, was supported by the military, co-opted by the military, and there was very much a close relationship in terms of how they related to each other. Like, for example, when I was a student at the ESG, the PRI would come down to the campus at the end of the year and give everybody their aguinaldo. It was their bonus. It was their loyalty to the government. It was always loyalty to the PRI. You didn't hear about the Mexican state. It was you were supporting the party. And so in the 90s, when that transition took place, and of course when the PRI lost the election in 2000, the question was, would the military stay loyal to the party, or would they stay loyal to the country and support the country? A key part of that was to create this identity of professionalism within the schooling system. So the ESG was formed in the 1930s. That's again the formative school for creating the leadership class in Mexico. They take in about 100 students each year. It's a 3-year program. The U.S. military, we would send 2 exchange officers. We would attend the 2nd year of the program. But for them it was a weeding out. So they would start for about 100. By the time they graduated, it would be about a cohort of about 30. And those 30 graduates become diplomados de Estado Mayor. They had a unique mark on their uniform. They would be the future leaders of Mexico's military. So the ESG was a very key component in fomenting, in this case, the future leadership. The Navy, similarly, they had their own schools in CESNAV, which is their center of the higher studies in the Navy. And then they stood up a national university, the CDN, in 1981, similar to kind of like what we have with National Defense University, to create more of a joint force component, or at least have members of different services attending school together, to think about issues of kind of national security level as opposed to operational and tactical level issues at the lower level schools. So during this particular time, most of the writing, most of the research when I was looking at it was, well, Mexico's military is apolitical. They haven't been involved in politics. We don't have military coups in Mexico like we see in other countries in Latin America. So the question is, were they really apolitical, or were they really kind of bought into the political process through this process of co-optation and being considered, again, part of the political structure that took place at the time? The other thing that makes Mexico a little unique is that they don't have a civilian minister of defense. There are two cabinet-level agencies, SEMAR, which is the Navy, and then SEDENA, which is the Army. And so similar to like we had during World War II, is, we had a Secretary of War and we had a Secretary of Navy. Mexico still keeps that model today. There's been pressure on them, particularly by the United States, to kind of change that model. We had something called the Defense Ministerial of the Americas that stood up back in the 90s. I was part of that. I was at U.S. Southern Command. It was an initiative of Secretary of Defense William Perry at the time. And the goal was to bring all the defense ministers together and promote civilian control of the military in Latin America. They did it in Williamsburg, Virginia. They had a big conference room, more like in a U shape. And what they did is they put one seat at the table and then other seats behind there. So for countries like Mexico, they came to the table and go, okay, who gets to sit in that seat? And it was done intentionally. Brazil was the same way. Brazil had, 3 heads with the Air Force included. And they went through the same thing. They had this discussion. They started to rotate. The bottom line is that the United States was kind of trying to support this idea of creating ministers of defense, civilian control of the military, by putting them in that position. Mexico has never bought into that model, and still today you have separate, military cabinet level positions between, again, in this case, SEDENA being the Army and SEMAR being the Navy. And the Air Force is not a separate branch. The Air Force is actually under the Army, and it's under SEDENA. And that's kind of interesting, again, when we get to our discussion on where the National Guard falls out in all this. So as Yvonne was mentioning, the military's gone through many changes because of the insecurity in Mexico, and one of the key events that take place is in 2009 when President Calderon declared in this case, his war on drugs, or really targeting what was called transnational criminal organizations. And the military got drawn into that very clearly early on, particularly in Ciudad Juarez. I was in Ciudad Juarez in May of 2009 doing research on a research trip with my other colleagues when they basically declared martial law in the city. The military came in, they took over all of the public services, they were basically running the government, they took over the policing functions. They were putting military soldiers in police vehicles to keep an eye on the police. But they were, again, the biggest problem, they were thrust into this more visible role of public safety. The military in Mexico has enjoyed a sense of anonymity, a sense of protection from a lot of public scrutiny. In many cases, it's considered to be less corrupt. It's just because it's not as transparent, in my view. But this really thrust them into that situation. And as a result of that, we saw some increase in human rights violations being documented. And there was a lot of pushback, particularly from governors and mayors, at this militarization of the military coming in, particularly in Chihuahua. I had a chance to have lunch with the Attorney General and the head of public safety for the state of Chihuahua, and they were very concerned about what Calderon was doing, and I know it was politically oriented too, because you had different political parties. But the point was that they resented the fact the military was taking over more of the public safety role, particularly at the state and local levels. Now, as I mentioned, public safety reform in Mexico has taken place at different times, even before President Calderon. Vicente Fox, who was, again, the PAN president who came in 2000, which ended the 70 years of pre-control, he tried to do something similar. He created the Federal Investigative Agency. It was meant to be similar to kind of like the U.S. FBI, and creating kind of a national level investigative police force. Also created a civilian Secretary of Public Safety. And that was to kind of help to kind of maybe depoliticize some of the security policy in the country. And he also created in this case, the Federal Preventive Police. But the issue was always this kind of still a lack of accountability, that there really wasn't kind of a clearly defined role and mission, identification. There was still that issue of transparency and also impunity, and whether in fact there would be a means available to hold public safety officials accountable. And so a lot of those changes didn't last. Again, we transitioned to Calderon, and then of course in 2012, the PRI comes back into power under Peña Nieto. And he also tried to do some reforms with public safety by creating what's called the Gendarmerie Nationale. I use the term SPF, a stability police force. That's a term that's used like the Italian Carabinieri and also the Civil Guard in Spain. They're meant to be kind of this idea of, again, a hybrid type of police and military. And so he tried to do something similar by creating the Gendarmerie. There was a goal to kind of follow a little bit of the Colombian National Police model at the time, which, if you know anything about Colombia, that's probably not a good model to follow, because they were, one of the main human rights violators in Colombia for many, many years, and came under the military. They weren't separate from, they actually under the military, subordinate to the military. So the bottom line is, under Peña Nieto, still ill-defined. There was a lot of opposition from other agencies in Mexico, particularly the non-governmental organizations were concerned about human rights violations and some of the other things that were happening with some of these. As a counter to that, which was interesting, is the military actually expanded their military policing functions. So in this case, you had the Marines expanding their Marine naval security, and then also the Army expanding their what we call the Policia Militar, military police agents, as kind of a counter or balance to what he was trying to do. So there really wasn't buy-in. There really wasn't kind of a sense of identity with this new model that Peña Nieto was trying to come up with. So when AMLO comes into office, of course, in 2018, first thing we see is the Plan Nacional de Paz y Seguridad. And this is what I focused my initial research when I came here to speak at Rice in 2019, was, what was developing as a result of that. One of the key components, of course, was the formation of the National Guard. So I wanted to kind of look at, where, in fact, this was, developing at the time, and where it's gone since that. But one of his goals as he came in was to make, in this case, to create that hybrid agency, this idea of a civilian police force merging with a military force to be able to combat organized crime. That was the goal, that was the mission, and as Yvonne mentioned, we really haven't seen them take on organized crime. If anything, the Guardia Civil is kind of still an unknown entity. They're everywhere. There's a lot of them out there. But the question is, what exactly are they doing? What exactly is their role and mission in Mexico today? But early on, that was the model that AMLO came up with. And the idea was to not make it subordinate to the military, but to have it under this civilian, in this case, the SSPC, or the Civilian Secretariat for Security and Civilian Protection, under Durazo. That was the first head at the time. So initially, it was stood up about 60,000. I mean, that's a considerable number. I think the entire Mexican military is like 250,000. So, I mean, you're talking about a big chunk of, creating a new military force in this case. The bulk of it did actually, about 80% did come from the military. And as I mentioned, many of them were those military police agencies, organizations out of SEDENA, and then, of course, the naval police out of SEMAR. And the other thing that he did do is he did disband the federal police. And again, the federal police, as you probably know, has a terrible reputation, a lot of corruption, a lot of violence. So in any case, it was kind of a popular move to disband them. The question was, what did you replace it with? So that was the goal early on. And so the initial paper that I wrote was looking at that. And so what I did is something called SWOT analysis. This is an analytical tool we use in the intelligence community. It basically stands for, as you see on the slide, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So since this was early on in kind of the formative stage, I wanted to try to assess it in a sense was, well, could there be some positive things? Not all negative, but could there be positive things that come out of that? And so one of them would be this idea, could in fact you demilitarize public safety by actually creating this sense? Get the military out of doing, in this case, countering transnational criminal organizations, which they wanted to do. And they were also, again, it would increase their ability to kind of go back to the barracks and do more of what they would consider to be more traditional military rules. And the other piece of it, it actually might lead to something to enhance community policing, which is a model we have in the United States. We've been debating that, we call intelligence-led policing versus community policing. Which model works best for confronting crime and some of the issues that we've had in our own country. Well, maybe this would be a way to do it with Mexico as well, by creating more police identity. And if these people came, and the Guardia Nacional came from those communities, there might be more identity with those communities and ability to have more, in this case, transparency and accountability. Of course, the weaknesses is that we tried it. In Mexico, as I mentioned, they tried reforming public safety, and that didn't work. The other part is that early on, even though it's meant to be a separate civilian cabinet level agency, really it was still under the military because they were mostly military. They had to actually physically retire from the military to join that. The General Busio, who formed it, had to basically resign his commission and then get hired back in as now a general in the National Guard. So that was part of the problem, is that, again, it really didn't really come under that civilian agency that AMLO initially said it would. And again, we still had some of the similar problems with the lack of accountability and transparency. The other issue, I said, well, what would be some opportunities that come out of this creating a new military organization? I jokingly say, we went through something called Space Force right now. A lot of people are still trying to figure out what that is and who they work for and what their future is. So, kind of similar, I said, could there something positive come out of this in terms of Mexico with the new National Guard? Well, could it, in this case, could it reflect more of Mexico's new nationalism as a result of AMLO coming in, as a result of the Trump administration, a lot of the antagonism that was taking place? Could, in fact, this organization help support that and actually contribute to a new identity in Mexico? And the other thing is, could it also model a U.S. model in terms of how we look at our National Guard in supporting governors and local communities? More disaster response, more ability to respond to the needs of the local communities. And as I mentioned, again, reflect more of those local populations and not that occupational force that the governors of Chihuahua was concerned about with Calderon's martial law. Of course, the threats always would, well, how did the military think about the National Guard? Did they see that as a threat? 60,000 troops, that's taken away from their resources. How would the military respond to that in terms of personnel, budget, missions? And would we also create, and this is the problems you had again with the marginalization, misappropriation of resources whenever you create new organizations, how is they're being accountable and so on. And one of the other issues, and this ties into the U.S. side of it, is what would be the impact on MERIDA and some of the security assistance programs we had going on with Mexico. When I gave my talk here in 2019, I remember being asked a question about MERIDA and AMLO's perception of it. At the time, I don't think AMLO really understood what MERIDA was and the funding mechanisms and what it was actually providing for, because there were a number of different components. It wasn't all just going to the military. It was going to some of those issues that he wanted to be addressed, the community issues, the source problems, and things like that. So anyway, so that was also an issue. What would happen with the U.S.-Mexico security relationship? How would we relate to this new National Guard in terms of military to military type organizations and programs and stuff like that? So that was the initial research. That's what's reflected in the paper. So what I'm doing now is trying to follow up on that, is look at what's changed, particularly looking at the roles and missions of the Guardia Nacional. AMLO made this statement in 2019 that they are reflecting Mexico, they are the community, that's who they are. So the question is that accurate? Is that in fact the case? And also, what are they doing? As we've seen so far, they were initially formed to combat transnational organized crime. We really don't see that happening. They got pushed into border security early on. If you remember, Trump then was going to say, was going to put basically a tax on, revenue going back and forth from Mexico, and this was seen as a threat if Mexico didn't do something about migration. And so suddenly we see the Guardia Nacional being pushed towards migration control on the northern border and also on the southern border. Some people jokingly said this was Trump's way of getting Mexico to pay for the wall, right? Okay, you just create a military organization to control migration in Mexico. We also see him pushed into public health because of COVID, infrastructure protection, and then some of the other ones, the civil defense, natural disaster response, were kind of the more, I would consider more the kind of the positive things that I would hope that a National Guard would do. The other thing is what was going on with the armed forces at the same time. They got pushed into some new missions. Obviously, combating fuel theft became a big one. We see them constructing the Felipe Ángeles International Airport. They also got involved in border security and immigration control and some of these other issues. Probably of those things on that list, the only one that the Guardia Nacional has not also been somewhat involved in would be on peacekeeping or any type of foreign support. And this was a recent change for the Mexican military to actually contribute to international peacekeeping or provide military forces outside the country. Because of the Estrada Doctrine and some of Mexico's historical ideas about non-intervention and things like that, Mexican's military did not traditionally support peacekeeping roles and missions, but that has changed. So that is one role that we see as a change, and that also comes from some of the professionalization training and things as a result of that. So more recently, and this is the area that I'm struggling with to try to get some answers on, is AMLO proposed a constitutional amendment basically now putting the GN under SEDENA. As far as I know, and from the interviews I've had up to this point, that has not been approved by Congress, but it's kind of like a de facto change. It's already happening anyway. They were always there to begin with, so now it's just becoming more formalized that now basically SEDENA controls the GN. As we mentioned, we don't, again, they seem to be deliberately avoiding confrontation with the transnational criminal organizations. They are throughout the country. We see them in quite a few places throughout the country. But I think it's primarily more in a show of force mission. It's kind of giving more perception that they're doing something, okay? And if I can use one example, it'd be after 9/11, when the United States shut down all air traffic and people didn't want to fly anymore. We put U.S. National Guard troops in U.S. airports. And some of you might remember that, going to fly, and there'd be a National Guard troop with a rifle in their shoulder, you know, with M16. What a lot of people don't realize is we never armed them. They never had bullets, so they could never actually stop anything because we were afraid that these young soldiers would actually shoot somebody. The bottom line, it was done just for public safety perception. And I think similarly happened today with Mexico with the Guardia Nacional. They're everywhere. At least they're giving people a perception that the government's doing something. And if you look at some of the public opinion polls, like El Financiero and INEGI, a couple of them come out and said, you know, their ratings are fairly high, 80-some% popular approval rates in terms of how people perceive the National Guard. If you interview academics and NGOs, you get a negative, much different perception on that. But in this case, I think the overall is that it's still kind of a work in progress. We're not really quite sure where it's going. And so this is what I'm researching right now. I'm trying to define what exactly, you know, will be the future. That one of them, of course, is post-AMLO. You know, will it continue after the end of the current administration? And the other one is, you know, what is the U.S. role in this? Are we contributing to increased militarization of Mexico through some of the security assistance programs? I've had a chance to interview NORTHCOM people, trying to reach out to some of the other U.S. agencies and so on to kind of get their take on what's going on. But with this change going from MERIDA to now what's called the Bicentennial Framework, it provides a new venue for security assistance between United States and Mexico. And the question is, you know, will there be direct funding programs going to GN versus SEDENA? Will SEDENA control that? You know, how will all of that particularly take place? And ultimately, what will be the impact on civil-military relations in Mexico going forward? So let me end with this thought, and I'll throw this out there just as maybe a discussion point when we get into our Q&A. I use this reading with my students. It's kind of like what we call what-if analysis in the intelligence community. Well, what if there was a military coup? The gentleman you see in the picture there is Charles Dunlop. He was a student at the U.S. Army War College back in the 1990s. And it was right after the end of the Cold War, Gulf War. The United States military was now in this new vote, who's the bad guys, who's our threats. So he looked at, in this case, what was happening in the United States. He wrote it as a fictional account, but he based it with a lot of empirical data and good research. So he looked at the expanded role of the U.S. military in public safety and other non-military roles post-Cold War here in the United States. And as he said, as a result of that, people became more trusting of the military than they did of their own political leaders. And so as a result, at the end of the day, is that the military eventually loses confidence in the political parties, the politicians. They can do it better, and the military actually does come in, and there's a military coup in the United States in 2012. So he wrote the essay as a letter from a military officer in jail about to be executed, writing to a colleague explaining what happened. They were both students at the War College together. Let me tell you how I see this developing. So the question is, and of course one of the precipitating events in this scenario was the United States military lost its warfighting ethos. They went to war against Iran and were defeated. So could something happen in Mexico? If we push the Mexican military and GN and some of the other forces more into public safety roles or non-traditional military roles, building airports, is it going to lead to more corruption? Is it going to lead to more impunity of these forces, lack of transparency? And will the people just feel like, well, the military gets things done compared to our politicians, which are always fighting with each other anyway? So the question is then, could something similar happen in 2024? Because we know AMLO right now would like to stay in power if he can change the Constitution. We've seen it happen with other political leaders in Latin America. So I just throw that out as kind of a thought piece kind of going forward. So just to kind of wrap things up so we can get to some questions. Early on, I think the SWOT analysis identified some of those positive and negatives of creating this new concept of a stability police force. Now I'm transitioning, I'm using a new methodology of something called pros, cons, faults, fixes, and that's really to assess some of these recent changes in terms of the roles and missions of the GN, and in this case, being put fully under the military. What will that really mean going forward, and not having civilian accountability, civilian control over what was meant to be, again, initially a hybrid civil-military type of an institution. So I'm going to go ahead and end there and turn it back over to Yvonne so we can have some questions.
Thank you, Professor. I don't know if the audience here has any questions. I'm going to start with a question, and then I will ask you again if you have questions. I got some on Zoom. The first question, you said something about the problem of centralized activities. And President López Obrador basically has centralized many activities in the National Guard and SEDENA. For example, you said about the Felipe Ángeles International Airport. We know that the security will be in charge of the National Guard, and SEDENA is going to operate and manage that airport. That means that they are going to get revenue. So what are the risks of Mexico's armed forces having access to money and more power for the rule of law in Mexico? We know that it's a big issue in Mexico.
Definitely, I think that is a real concern going forward. You know, having worked with other Latin American militaries, I mean, there are other, and I'll just use an example like with the Chilean military. You know, they have a big take of the copper industry, and that's how they fund a lot of the military budget in Chile. I would be concerned about that if, in fact, that's now seen as primarily a cash revenue. The military fund military, in this case, military development and things through, through infrastructure. I guess that's the main thing. So they're also involved in with the Tren Maya, the new tourist train they're developing. So I think it is a troubling incident when you put the military directly involved in infrastructure, in public works, and things that actually have a financial incentive for them to draw from and actually be compensated through. Because you lose the funding model where they should be accountable to, in this case, to the members of Congress who basically approve a budget. And so you shouldn't have to say, well, the military is getting paid out of that, we don't need to fund them. I said, I've seen that happen in other countries. It's not a good model. I'd be very concerned in Mexico if they go down this path.
Yeah, that's a big issue. I don't know if you have a question here. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Quick question. When the Mexican National Guard was created with the 60,000 personnel, all that personnel was taken away from the Army and the Naval. Was a net reduction or?
Yeah, that's one of the questions I haven't been able to really kind of determine, because part of the problem in Mexico is, and I saw this when I was a student down there, is we would go to Mexican military bases and you would see pictures on the wall of kind of like the units that were supposed to be part of that base. And you see like the leader and then maybe the NCOIC and then maybe a couple, and then it's like blank spaces go. So you never really knew how many people they actually had in a lot of those units, because for one way it was a way to increase drawing funds for those units just by saying we had 60, we have a brigade here of 50,000 people, when in reality they may have 15,000. So part of it is that number, if it was in fact that a 60,000 direct reduction taken from the military, or were those numbers that weren't even there to begin with. So that's a little bit, my research right now is really haven't been able to define clearly what those numbers mean. But in essence, it is correct though that of that 60,000, the 80% of those did come from, in this case, people with military backgrounds. They were active duty, retired, or brought back on active duty, coming from the military, compared to primarily coming from the federal police. That was a much smaller number.
And as a follow-up, the budget, was that budget transfer? Is that new budget? Who pays for the?
Again, that's one of my research questions I haven't been able to really find out yet, is on the budget issues. The other issue I really have a question about is like pay and compensation. Does the Guardia Nacional get the same benefits? Was there an incentive for them to move into the GN compared to staying in the military? Is there a loss of, in this case, some of those, again, perks that the military typically had when they went to the GN? I've not been able to talk, I've only been able to talk to like a couple active duty military officers. They're mostly very difficult to open up about this. So those are some of the questions I'm still working on, trying to find answers to. Because I think they're very critical in trying to understand what the relationship between these organizations will be going further down the road. If they stay subordinate to, in this case, SEDENA, will they just become another branch of the military, like the Air Force, also subordinate to the Army? Because the Air Force was always considered to be a secondary service in Mexico. It's always subordinate to the Army. It doesn't get the resources, it doesn't get the funding compared to the Army side of it. And so that would be my concern with the GN. If it's just subordinated to SEDENA, is it just going to be all the funds come into SEDENA and then SEDENA, distributes through there, as opposed to going through the civilian secretariat, which is initially where they were supposed to be, and then the funds being distributed through that civilian agency.
Any other question?
First, Professor Kjord, welcome to the great state of Texas.
Thank you.
And Professor Rodriguez Sanchez, muchas gracias por invitarme a su magnífico institución. For someone who loves Mexico, who had the privilege of working in Mexico, who had an office in Tijuana with a despacho de abogados for 4 years as a lawyer, who was in Tijuana when Colosio was, in Ensenada when Colosio was assassinated in 1994. I have this deep, deep admiration for the Mexican people. I was in Tijuana just before COVID on a delegation as a traductor for a delegation from China who needed someone to speak Chinese and Spanish. And I saw the booming of Tijuana. Professor Jesus Silva, who was the partner at my law firm, articulated Tijuana as the new New York of Mexico. So I see this strange tension with the greatness of Mexico and the problems that you and your colleagues are trying to address. And it hurts my heart, my love of Mexico. I want to say this. And so I guess getting to my questions from a 20,000-foot perspective. I have no way to talk the details with someone of your caliber, sir. But would there be a possibility to see like the influence of the decriminalization of drugs here in the United States? Would that possibly be a solution to some of the terrible violence that's breaking my heart in Mexico? Is there any talk of that? I know that there seems to be a trend of decriminalizing or wanting to decriminalize marijuana in Mexico. Would that be part of the solution, sir? And am I too far afield with that question to pose that to you?
No, actually, I'll be honest with you. That's probably not my area. It's more of Yvonne's, looking at criminal activity and things like that. I just know from looking at the threat as a military officer and doing a threat assessment. When the military looks at different organizations, you assess combat capabilities, things like that. I think, and I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne on that. But it seems like so many of these cartels have expanded into so many different areas now. It's not just drugs anymore. It's avocados. I mean, it's iron ore being shipped out of Lázaro Cárdenas. So I think, if anything, they're more entrepreneurial, that if, in fact, they did decriminalize it, they would just find other venues to continue their activities. But I think the issue is, for somebody from a military perspective, and I'm looking at how do you combat transnational organized crime? That's a big part of U.S. Northern Command's focus on security assistance to Mexico. And that's where a lot of the merit of funding was going in to increase the military capabilities to go after these heavily armed gangs. And many of them, like the Zetas, were former military themselves, so they had a lot of combat power, and they were outmanned, outgunned in many cases. The bigger side for me on that would be, what are we contributing, and what can the U.S. do to help prevent the criminalization or the arming of a lot of these criminal gangs? And that's the transiting of arms across the border. In Mexico, the Mexicans, government will say the same thing. You want us to control drugs, we want you to control arms. And I had a surreal conversation at U.S., it was in the Joint Task Force North. We had just crossed the border from Ciudad Juarez. This was in 2009. I was with my Mexican colleague, Abelardo Rodriguez, and Canadians. We went to Joint Task Force North. We're sitting with U.S. military officers, and we're talking about Mexico's, the crime problem and all that, and said, well, we want Mexico's help in controlling drugs across the border. Abelardo asked, well, why don't we get U.S. help controlling arms coming across the border? And this one U.S. military officer says, well, we have the Second Amendment in this country. People are allowed to own arms. I'm like, that's your response? I mean, that's not a response. I mean, that doesn't mean you can transit them illegally across the border. So I think we have a problem in this country about what we can do to help that process in terms of reducing the capacity of a lot of these criminal organizations when it comes to, at least on the military side, from their war-fighting capacity. I'll let you address kind of the drug side of it and whether you think that would help the decriminalization.
Well, I think that, as you said, the issue is that both countries have to realize about that problem. And in some way, Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is not facing any problem of security. So if that's the case, we are going to still have a lot of problem of drug trafficking on the border. So the National Guard was supposed to be helping that area, but it's not good doing that. And that's why I have, in that regard, a question about the last elections, that we saw that organized crimes were involved in Mexico in the elections. And we can see, well, I'm going to ask Professor Kilroy about that maybe we can end up with a narco state, or I don't know if we can possibly see in the future, because we saw that problem at the border, but now we have in the whole country that problem. So I don't know if we can end up with a narco state if the inaction of the federal government continues and the National Guard is not doing that job. So what do you think, Professor?
I know right before I left the military, there was a study that was put out by the U.S. Joint Forces Command, which has since been disbanded. But they were looking at future threats, and one of them was to look at failed states. And they wrote a very controversial report because they said, two states that are very potentially could become failed states were Mexico and Pakistan at the time. Of course, Pakistan has nukes, which makes it much more complicated. But when that report came out, it was like suddenly said, well, Mexico, how could it possibly be Mexico? I think the response has been, and what I tell people is, I don't think Mexico's in danger of becoming a failed state. I think they have failed states, meaning that there's parts of Mexico where there is such control by these transnational criminal organizations where they do actually co-opt the police forces, the military, the political leaders. I mean, we've seen that, of course, obviously, in many parts of the country itself. Could that expand then become a kind of a national concern? I do have concern, and I share your love for Mexico too. It's a country, me encanta mucho, and I've enjoyed traveling and living in Mexico. And it is heartbreaking to see what's happening to a lot of these communities where there is a sense of insecurity, where people just don't really, again, who do you turn to? And when Calderon turned to the military and sent them in to fight, the war against these transnational criminals, he was calling in the cavalry. I mean, there was nobody back there. Those were the reserves. And we call strategic reserves in military forces, like, you don't commit all your forces, but when he did that, it was all in. And the question is now, what's next? This Guardia Nacional is supposed to have taken on that role, let the military out. It's not doing it. But if people are feeling, again, if the public opinion polls can be trusted and people have at least a perception of some greater security, then maybe there is some value to putting more of them in their gray and white uniform, whatever this new uniform they wear, which is meant to be different from the military uniform. And at least people feel more secure, then there is some advantage to, at least from a public perception standpoint. But it's still not dealing with the specific problems of Mexico, which is, again, this idea of these criminal organizations that have, in fact, increased their, obviously, their capabilities and breadth over the country. So.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a quick question from the audience on Zoom. We have only like 5 minutes. Oh my God, where it is now? Okay. Do you see Andrés Manuel López Obrador having a strong hold over the military, or is the military just following his initiatives pragmatically, duty-wise?
That's a good question. It's funny because when I've been doing interviews with academics, with government officials, NGOs, some different organizations, and I asked them that question and said, who's really behind this? Is it really AMLO in charge, or is the military in charge? Who's the ones really kind of driving this train right now? And they kind of said, because I was interested in Bucio. I actually spoke with somebody who was involved in his academic research. Bucio actually has a PhD. He's very educated. The General Bucio heads the National Guard, very non-traditional military. So I was thinking, like, where does he kind of see his role in that? And his comment back, this one particular individual said, well, he's just a military officer following orders. He doesn't really have an agenda. He's got no real future. He doesn't have an issue with the guard and all that. AMLO told him to do that, he'll do that. So at least their perception is that the military is following the lead of AMLO as president of the country, that they're being loyal soldiers, they're saluting, they're doing their mission. I would have a different take a little bit on that. I think to a certain extent that is the public persona, the public perception. But the military, as I mentioned to you, it's not apolitical. The Mexican military has always been behind the scenes. They're very influential, and we've seen presidents defer to the military throughout Mexico's history. And if you can think about that, the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre with Diaz Ordaz, and yeah, there was issues there about the military taking control and giving the country back to the president. I got quotes that say that. So I think the military always has been a key player and much more involved than probably they want to admit. But I would, at least for the public perception side of it, at least there is a perception that they are basically just being loyal to AMLO. The question that becomes, what happens after AMLO?
Yeah.
And that was the question I had initially. It's like, what happens after the PRI, loses political power?
The same.
If I have time to ask, so there have been in the last 10, 12 years 3 political parties, PAN, PRI, and then now the MORENA. Is the allegiance of the military to the president or to the party in power?
When you go to the Escuela Superior de Guerra, they have their flag ceremony right there in front, and they have a saying, there's carved in the stone, they said, La patria es primero, the country is first. We're loyal to the country first. But we all know that they were very loyal to the political structure and the party, and as I mentioned, the whole Aguinaldo thing and all that, was always to kind of create the institutional loyalty to the political process themselves. I had a discussion with, if you guys remember, when Cardenas broke off and formed the PRD, remember he was considered to be, Lázaro Cardenas' son and, key pillar of the PRI and all that, and suddenly he broke off. I had military officers in Mexico say, we could never support him as president. He's a communist. We could never do that. He's disloyal. He left the PRI. How could we ever support? So I'm like, okay, but if he's elected president, aren't you subordinate to whoever is elected president? And they're like, no, we would never allow that to happen. Oh, okay. So the question now becomes, you're right. Are they primarily loyal now to AMLO? I think AMLO basically has co-opted the military to an extent that it's supporting his goals and agenda, which is basically to try to consolidate power and increase Morena's, standing, and hopefully, have a Morena, at least a Morena, candidate win the next election to continue many of his policies and programs. But I think the earlier identity in terms of the Mexican military, I think, has expanded beyond just personalism of an individual to to now do think of this idea of a national identity of the nation and so on. And that's why I thought the Guardia Nacional, at least in my original analysis, said, is there some possibility they could take on a new identity and you know, support Mexican nationalism, similar to kind of have our National Guard does that at kind of a state level and local level, in supporting those local communities and supporting the, you know, the people that, you know, are in those communities. I haven't seen that. I'm concerned now, the Guard being brought up under SEDENA, it's just going to continue to, again, force more of the traditional models, as opposed to kind of create a new SPF with a new national identity, which would then get away from the personalism and identity with a particular individual or a political party. So honestly, at this point, I think the jury's still out. I think we have to see what's going to happen in 2024. That's why, if you notice, I put question marks on AMLO's, you know, will his term end in 2024, or will he actually be able to change the Constitution and stay on? So.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Quiro, for your very interesting remarks on the National Guard. I appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event at the Baker Institute, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.